Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Brian from Gurufy. I see we got a lot of folks here in the YouTube chat. If you can, drop a comment. Let me know where you are in the world. I'm on the West Coast of the United States, and also let me know a little bit about what you're applying for right now, the applications that you're going through. And if any point along the way you have any questions about anything I'm saying, be sure again to you know drop a note in the comment section, so I can address it right away. And the more you let me know kind of about what your application is, maybe some sticking points that you're experiencing, some particular advice that you might want, the better I might be able to help you. All right. So I'm really looking forward to talking with you guys today about what a lot of times is the most complicated and difficult part of the application process. All right. So we have Kanita Ahmed is joined from Toronto, gorgeous city. I went to the University of Michigan, and I used to go to Toronto sometimes for relaxing weekends. One of the great cities in the world. Also have some folks from New Delhi. Good morning, I guess. Good evening to you. All right, full-time MBA programs across the country. Yeah, this will be perfect, perfect for you. All right, so like I was saying, I think that one of the most difficult parts of the application process is on the personal statement in particular, is actually getting started. We've all kind of experienced that moment when you sit down to write your personal statement and you have a blank screen and the flashing cursor, and it's almost like it's taunting you. You don't know where to begin. And there's a couple of things that kind of make it a little bit more complicated. Is that one, a lot of people who are applying to business school don't necessarily come from a writing background, and so they don't feel comfortable, writing an essay. Sometimes it might be language barriers, but even people who are pretty conversant as writers, it's also the case that they'll try sometimes to lean too hard on methods and styles and techniques that they used when they were writing their undergraduate MBA or personal statements. And those things don't really quite translate perfectly. And the last thing that complicates this process is that this is a really high stress thing, right? You have, say, 500 words, 900 words, whatever it is that the school places a limit on, and you feel like you gotta tell your whole life. And as a result, people can feel frozen, frozen by the prospect of what they have to do and say. All right, so who are we? Again, I'm Brian Fobi. I'm at gurufy.com. You can find us there. Since 2008, makes me feel old to to drop that date, but we've helped over 10,000 applicants get into their dream schools. We focus entirely on the written portions of your application, personal statements, CVs, etc. And you can check us out at gurufy.com. All right, so let's jump right into it. The two most common mistakes, all right, I like to call it the kind of Goldilocks problem, is that people are either way over the top in their introductions, right? The first paragraph, the first part of their personal statement, or they're too rote and robotic. All right. So you have this too hot and too cold problem. And either of these can really harm your personal statement. And so I'm going to kind of describe these problems and also some ways that you can avoid making these very common mistakes. All right. So the first is what I like to call the gleaming knife problem. I'm just realizing that as I made this graphic, that's a butter knife. That's not necessarily the most frightening and intimidating of knives. But you'll understand what I'm talking about here in a second. So the gleaming knife problem comes from a conference that was a conference of admissions officers and admissions directors that was held at the University of California at Berkeley about a decade and a half ago. And they were talking about what they like to call the gleaming knife problem, which is that students often feel the need to have this way kind of over the top flash bang boom um, introduction that immediately seizes the reader's attention and blows them away. And so the example that they gave was from a personal statement that someone wrote. It says, as I stood in the alleyway, I stared at the gleaming knife. My life flashed before my eyes. All right. So uh, Tejas here says, one thing that's been playing on my mind as I've been writing applications is whether the essay should be more conversational, more formal in tone. So this is actually one of the things we're going to talk about here. So, right. So this is not really conversational or formal, the gleaming knife problem. It's more that someone is trying to tell like an over the top story in order to grab your attention. Okay. Now, so why is this a problem? All right. Um, People do this because one of the most common pieces of advice that I don't think is a good piece of advice, um, especially if you're not a really great writer who knows how to craft these things with thoughtfulness, is that people always say you got to have a great hook, right? This opening paragraph has got to be like over the top and super engaging and wow, oh my god, I can't believe that. And they want to stand out, right? So you got to have a hook. You got to have a hook. People always say that. So don't bite the hook. This is a bad piece of advice, or at least it's an advice that can lead you down a bad road. And the kind of the funny thing about it is they say, "Oh, I want to stand out, right? I want to feel like, if I have this amazing introduction that, makes the reader feel this sense of awe or fireworks or whatever it is, that's going to be the thing that makes my application stand out." But it's a mistake. First, because it comes across as forced and gimmicky. All right. Um, and as a result, it doesn't feel authentic. And authenticity is one of the most important things that you want to have in your personal statement. All right. And when it comes across as forced or gimmicky, when you try for fireworks, you will almost always fail in that regard. And it will come across as cliche. And so, this thing that you're doing in order to make yourself stand out actually makes you sound like 1,000 other applicants that the admissions directors have seen. So, just as an example, even though people apply to business school, and one of the most common stories that I will consistently see in essays is always what the bedside death, which is someone at their grandmother's. It's always a grandmother or grandfather's bedside as they die, and they kind of open their essay with this tear-filled story about how this moment inspired their life. The problem with that kind of story is that if you have read over the years, literally hundreds of them, it doesn't have the emotional impact that you think it will. And you will say, okay, here's another case of someone who is trying to emotionally manipulate me. And I can tell you, having sat in those rooms and having read probably at this point in my life, I don't know, 10,000 personal statements, that an essay that tries to begin with like a huge emotional moment, how it feels when you read it, if it's not really authentic and it doesn't feel true, it feels like someone is trying to emotionally manipulate you. All right. And it says, okay, this is not real. It's not true to who this person is. Okay. Another way to think about this is that kind of the more fireworks that you pack in, or the more kind of huge emotions that you want to stack into your essay, the higher the bar in terms of writing quality and writing precision that it's going to take. Right. So this is not, another way of saying this is that you can write these kind of huge fireworks openings, but it is much, 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 much harder to do well. And in 99 cases out of 100, applicants don't do it well, and it ends up falling into the cliche side of things. Right. And then the last thing I'll note here is that you want your essays, your personal statements, to always feel like it's what I call a seamless whole. Like the whole thing feels like it's coming from one person. It is telling the experience, the perspective, the hopes of one person. And at the end of the essay, I should feel like I know you. So if Sally writes an essay, all of the parts of the essay sort of feel like they're coming from the same person and the same story. But if you open with a really intense pace or a huge kind of emotional moment, then it turns up the volume right away. But the essay can't maintain that, right? And so it ends up feeling disjointed, and it produces an essay that's not very interesting or compelling. And that's a problem. All right. So on the flip side, right? So we've talked a little bit about the Goldilocks, excuse me, the Goldilocks problem of too hot, right? So here is the Goldilocks problem of it's too cold. Now, this is most commonly seen, at least in my experience, when people are answering kind of a very common essay prompt, which is something like, tell us your medium term and long term goals. All right. For some reason, many people are quite adamant that they need to include at the start of an essay a sentence that reads something like, my short term goal is da 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 da, right? Almost like an algorithm or a robot is writing the essay, right? My short-term goal is to go to McKinsey and do this. My long-term goal is to do that. That's boring, right? And it instantly kind of puts your essay on a really low temperature that doesn't engage the reader. All right. So why do applicants do this then? One, I think people are really, really worried a lot of times about clarity. So they say, "Oh, like if they ask me this question, I have to make it absolutely clear that I am answering this." So right off the bat, if they want to know what are my short-term goals and my long-term goals, the very first sentence is, "My short-term goal is boom," and I'll go from there. Second paragraph opens, "My long-term goal is this." All right. Second thing is, I think a lot of people who come to this are from the business world, so they're used to writing memos that are skimmed. So the idea is, uh, you know, um, someone's going to read something in 20 seconds, so you just have to like have the bullet points there, like short-term goal X, long-term goal Y. All right, but that's not what this is. You have to give your readers a little bit more credit. Um, Admissions officers will read your whole essay. Okay. Now, I can tell you truthfully that like the better written it is, the more engaged they will be in how deeply and how much kind of time and focus they put into reading your essay. Um, and so you don't want it to feel like a memo, because if they encounter it as something that they can just skim, even if they don't really go into it with the intention of skimming, what'll happen is if you're just saying short-term goal X, long-term goal Y, that's how they will read it. Okay. So give your reader a little bit of credit and assume that they're actually going to read the thing. And so if you want to have a little bit of a runway into answering the question, right, you can do it, and you can have the actual answer to the question, say at the end of the first paragraph. Um, you obviously do want to make sure that you answer the question, but you don't have to answer it like a robot or an algorithm. That simply the first thing that comes out of the screen is the direct rote answer to the question. All right. So I will make one little asterisk here and point this out, which is that this isn't quite true when we're talking about very, very short essays. So sometimes, business schools will say, in 100 words, what is your short-term goal? There, you really do have to kind of do a smash and grab, be very, very direct. My short-term goal is this, because 100 words is just a couple of sentences. And so you don't really have the space to tell like a full-throated story. And so you do need to be direct there. But when you're talking about a standard personal statement length, then it's really important that you not answer it in a really robotic way. Okay. And lastly, I think sometimes people wrongly assume that an essay is entirely just about the information, right? That it's like a CV, and it's not about kind of the style and the storytelling. And that's a mistake. That style, like how you tell a story, how you engage with the person, shows how you think about the world. That you can see things in an interesting way. That you can engage someone, make them interested in you. That's a skill to have in business school and in entrepreneurship, et cetera. And so if you tell an interesting story, um, it will be interesting to them. Okay. So again, your reader will read your whole essay. Make sure that you answer the question, but you don't have to do it right away. And you can see I made a previous video, I think back in the winter, sort of talking about storytelling and how to do it. But remember, the kind of the long story short version of that is that um, how you tell a story. This seems like an obvious point, but it's often missed. How you frame a story, how you lead up to kind of the relevant parts. That's a really important thing. And so don't just view your personal statement as like a more fully written out narrative version of your CV. That's not. A CV and a personal statement do two very different things. A CV is supposed to be kind of your whole life. Like, this is all the things I've done. This is where I went to school. These are my professional accomplishments. These are my skills, etc. The personal statement is much more about going deep on a narrower set of experiences. So, if your CV has 25 or 30, 40 items, a personal statement will have 2 or 3 things that you dive deep on and provide a real sense of content and depth. Okay. So do focus on storytelling and make sure that you're not just coming across as a robot. Now, like I said, this is like a Goldilocks problem. You don't want to come across as too hot, but you also don't want to come across as too cold and robotic. So this kind of then creates a problem where you say, look, I feel like I'm trying to thread this needle where too cold is a problem, too hot is a problem. So how do I actually go about solving this? All right. So tip 1, you can use the same story a lot of times, but you just turn down the temperature. Okay. So what do I mean by this? So go back to the initial problem that I talked to about, the so-called gleaming knife problem, right? Now, if you do really want to use that story for whatever reason, instead of like starting the essay in the alleyway with the gleaming knife, right? Take a step back. All right. So, how you open the essay doesn't have to be at the exact moment of peak crisis or tension. All right. Say, okay, there's another point in this story that allows me to have a moment of reflection. All right. So, um, say, okay, instead of having the story begin in the alleyway, why don't I have it begin in the police station where I'm kind of processing the emotions of what happened? And then you can fill in the details as you move forward. So you might have an opening, instead of the gleaming knife, you say, I'd never been to a police station before. And as I sat there giving the detective my statement, I hoped I would never be back. All right. Then you can tell the story if you want. All right. Um, Again, to use the story that I often see of, like, sitting at your grandma's, deathbed. And I've seen this in literally hundreds of business school applications. People talk about this as like a seminal moment. Um, don't don't have the story begin with you sitting at her bedside and there's always a tear coming down her cheek, right? Those are all the cliche things that you would expect from that story. Instead, maybe have it come later, right? Maybe you, in a where you start your story in a conversation that you had with your brother or father about your grandmother, or you start the story at a moment where you're reflecting on a lesson that she told you, right? Because the important thing to remember with any moment that you choose to highlight in a personal statement is it's not the moment or the crisis or the difficult time. It's not that's not really the thing that's important. It's your reaction to it. Okay. How did this difficult moment, right, frame how you or define who you are now and how you're moving forward with future crises? Okay. So instead of focusing right off the bat on the thing that happened, tilt it just a little bit and think, okay, when was the first time that this moment uh actually defined and changed something about me and I could tell? So um you know if you if for example, you're using the grandma example, maybe there was a moment later in your business career where a lesson that she told you informed the decision that you made. Said, oh, here's this lesson that I didn't quite get, that she told me, 5 years ago, and now I understand its importance. All right. Or again, to use the gleaming knife example, instead of beginning the essay with the story of a robbery, right, you can have that later on in the essay, but maybe that's the moment that led you to think about working on public safety campaigns in your city, right? So you could start with maybe canvassing in your city, right? So just find a different entryway into the story so that the story right away doesn't have this over the top sense to it. Now, this is obviously like kind of a little bit tricky, because you've got to calibrate it pretty finely. And this is where a lot of times you can rely on friends who are skilled writers, people like me, etc., who can give you a sense of perspective of like, look, this is either a little bit dry or it's a little, you're coming in too hot, in order to find a way to tell this story in a way where the core beats of it and the lesson are there, but it doesn't come across immediately as a cliche. All right. Tip 2 is what I call writing it upside down. Now, it's not this crazy yoga pose that you see here, but it's something a little bit more straightforward, which is that I would always suggest that if this is something that you struggle with, um, start your essay, right, the actual writing process, by writing the rest of the essay first, and then come back and do the introduction. Write the introduction last. Okay. What this allows you to do is to write about like the core content in a way that lets you understand what the tone that you want your essay to have, what are the themes and ideas that are in your essay, um, how you want the reader to think about those things, right? So if you say these are the 3 experiences that I had that inform why I want to go to business school and why I want to say found a company that does X, Y, and Z, right? When you write the rest of the essay, there's something about the writing process that makes things really specific and clear for you. And so you say, okay, now I understand what it is exactly that I'm trying to do and say and become. And I can use that information to then highlight a portion of a story that I can use as the introduction. And I can plan out my introduction in a way that's a little bit more thoughtful. Because a lot of times what happens is when you start with the introduction as the first thing that you feel like you have to write, then you'll say, okay, let me start with something really big, but you can't really maintain that for the rest of the way. All right. So when you turn it on its head and decide to write the introduction last, what tends to happen is that it feels more authentic to the story, it feels more attached to the story, and it ends up coming across as something that's a little bit more real, and coherent. It all feels like it fits together, as opposed to here's this action movie that I stuck on top of a personal statement. And that's not really what you want. And lastly, this is a really tricky piece of advice for reasons I'll explain in a second, but I think it's really important, and that's to be yourself. Okay. Um, One of the problems with hooks and gimmicks or like these big flashy openings is that it feels to the reader like you're not telling your story, you are telling a version of your story that's designed specifically um to impress the reader, right? Now in truth, that's what you're doing, right? You are writing a story with the admissions committee in mind, thinking about the things that they want. But when you have gimmicks and hooks, it feels a little bit more naked and obvious, and so you don't want that. You end up sounding like every other applicant, as I've noted. And so, what you want to do in these situations, right, in terms of being yourself, is to say, look, what I am, for example, right? So, I'm a more like analytical and compassionate person, or I am like a problem solver, right? Figure out these core things that kind of define you as a person and as applicant, and make sure that's the thing that you highlight both in your essay and your introduction. So, you don't want like if your whole story and your kind of positioning is that you are, say, an analytic and compassionate person, what does the gleaming knife have to do with any of that, right? It ends up framing actions that aren't really directed and clear, and pointed at the things that you're trying to kind of accomplish, achieve, and highlight. All right. All right. So overall, I forgot I was going to say one more thing about the be yourself. Um, be yourself can be a really frustrating piece of advice for people to give because for a couple of reasons. One, we have lots of selves, right? There's a person that we are with our friends, there's a person we are in professional settings with our wives, our kids, or whatever. And so what you have to think about is, who am I in the context of what I'm applying for? So you're applying to business school, right? You're applying to get an MBA. So think about your achievements and your accomplishments and how you think about problems within this space, and use that to build your personal statement. All right. And don't try to stretch for a story or an idea or like this over the top thing that doesn't actually resonate with your experience and what you think and then people who know you think are kind of your core strengths. All right. Um, so I'm going to answer the questions here in a second, but I just want to quickly wrap up and say again, do's and don'ts, right? Do avoid robotic openings. Do care about storytelling and authenticity. Make sure that the things that you are talking about feel like you. Right. A good way to judge this is to give your essay to a friend and say, "Hey, read this. Does it sound like me?" Okay. And if it does, if they say no, this sounds like some Avengers version of yourself, then maybe say, "Okay, I might have gotten the tone wrong." Right. And embrace that what makes you special isn't what makes someone else special. So if an approach or theme or idea worked for someone else, it may not work for you. And this is something, again, as a consultant, I get all the time where someone says, "Hey, look, my friend got into Wharton by highlighting these three things. Those are the three things I want to highlight." And I'll say, look, man, like your friend got into Wharton by highlighting those three things because those are three things that were present in their life and list of accomplishments and CV. Those aren't there for you. That doesn't mean there's not a path to the school you want to get to, but it has to be one that's built on a sense of what you are authentically. All right. Lastly, don't try to be someone you're not to that point. Don't try for a wow opening with lots of fireworks or crazy emotionality. And don't create an opening whose pacing, tone, and theme don't align with the rest of the essay. Okay. Now, there's a couple of questions in here that I wanted to circle back to. One thing that's been playing on my mind as I've been writing my application is whether the essay should be conversational or more formal in tone. All right. So let me give you the most frustrating answer that anyone can ever give you, and then kind of explain it. All right. So the answer is that it depends. Okay. Um, it depends on what. All right. So let's say, for example, well, I'll start with this point. If you feel more comfortable writing in a conversational tone, then write in that tone. If you feel like you're maybe a more analytical person or more formal person, then write in that tone. All right. Now, let me tell you some of the strengths and weaknesses of each. A conversational tone, the obvious strength is that it can do a little bit better in terms of establishing rapport, making you seem like a real human. It makes it easier for you in the course of your essay to kind of access and display some of the things that you were thinking or feeling. The downside is that you've got to be really careful about coming across as too flippant or too glib. All right. This shouldn't be, it's not a comedy show. Avoid jokes. Um, you know, you do want to make sure that your language still comes across as mature, right? It can be conversational in tone, but still mature. All right. I need to feel like I'm still talking to an adult who's being serious about things. Okay. And obviously, when you're talking about more serious subjects, you'll do want to maybe, make sure that you lean slightly more, uh, excuse me, towards something that's formal. Now, in terms of like a more formal tone, um, again, the strengths are a lot of times clarity, right? You can say like, this is what we're doing. You do come across as more mature. Um, And if, for example, you're more kind of on the quant side of things, a lot of times it makes sense to talk about complex quantitative, algorithmic things in a slightly more formal tone. Um, the downside is that if you lean too heavily on it, two problems can occur. One is that it can be boring. And so you do want to make sure that you find ways, even with a slightly more formal tone, that you have some element of storytelling in it. Um, and then the other one is that people who write formally, they can often drift into too much jargon. All right. So remember that if you have, a lot of like memoese, as we might call it. So that, you talk about, oh, we're going to leverage this or that, right? Like those are kind of business terms that have very specific meanings, but people throw leveraging around everywhere. If I had a penny for every essay that I saw that had the word leverage in it, just kind of thrown around, I could retire tomorrow. All right. So do make sure that you just avoid talking like a business memo from your HR department. Okay. So that's one of the dangers there. But at the end, when you're assessing kind of the tone and style to take into account what you are comfortable with. what's the nature of the story that you're telling, and what are the strengths of your application, and what are the things that you are worried about conveying, and you take all of those kind of factors and decide, which direction you choose. In the end, it's probably not going to be that you're going to choose one of two paths. It's that you're going to be somewhere in the middle, and you have to figure out exactly how much to one side or the other you're tacking towards. The one thing that I will say to add to that is that a good piece of advice is to write like you talk. Okay, when you see like a whereas or a heretofore, or like these words that are people never say, but you will see in formal documents, leave those out, right? Again, a good kind of tip that you can use is to sit down and read your essay to your friend. Don't have them read it, you read it out loud to them. You can also do it in the mirror, but one of the things I think that works when you read an essay out loud to a friend is that you'll sometimes feel self-conscious about a bit of text and like, that's a little funky. And so you'll feel like, that's not something I would say. And if it's not something you would say in a way that you would say it, then think about changing it. Okay. It should feel like something, like almost like a person talking to you, and not like they're reading a business memo. Okay. Another question, would it be all right if I start with a snippet that is a key moment in the middle of the story? Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a little bit trickier to do, all right? But I like removing chronology from essays. You don't have to start from when you were 17 and then move to now. Instead, what you can do is you can sort of take the reader kind of in a point that you think is the most interesting, and you can work forward from there. Okay. And so, yeah, it can be in the middle. And in fact, I think a lot of times a good tactic that can work as a storytelling moment is to have like something that's kind of an interesting moment in the middle of a story as you get your first paragraph. And then you have like a kind of a hard reset or a softish reset for your second paragraph that then maybe takes them back to the beginning, and you move forward and you move back to that point. And you see, a theme that I like a lot when working with clients to get them to understand what their personal statement should do is to sometimes think about parts of it as like a movie. And you do see movies that do this. They start a little bit in the middle, and then they will like take you back through it. So yeah, you can start wherever. You do not in your personal statement have to have strict chronological adherence. Strict chronology is an easier thing to do. So if you don't feel perfectly conversant and strong as a writer, then don't do that. But you can play with it and figure out, exactly the chronology and how to work that. All right. Let's see. In your experience, would you recommend tying aspects of your story to what the school has to offer? Maybe a particular class by a specific professor or student club. Yes. All right. So again, this question is the idea of tying aspects of your story to what the school has to offer, a particular class, specific professor, student club. Yes. To repeat a theme that I talked about earlier, I think that essays that work well read like a single coherent idea. All right. And so, if, for example, you are applying, like the thing that you want to do is kind of, you're a quant and you have an idea for kind of a technical finance company, and you open with a story about you tried this thing and either worked or didn't, or the story is somehow related to that field, right? And you want to apply to MIT Sloan, right, a kind of very quanty school. Then it would make sense to say, look, here's the things I tried and I either succeeded or failed at, or I became super intrigued by this through the process of this experience. I know that in order to like do this at the level that I want to, I need to understand these things. And so you can then start to tie in a very specific way to the school. And the reason that is such a great approach is that I will oftentimes get personal statements that people ask for consultation on. And what they will do is they've written one essay and they'll sort of bracket out, or where they'll say like, I want to go to, and then you'll see brackets and it'll say like in all caps, school name. And it's clear that what they're going to do is they'll sort of do copy paste, and then like they'll use the same essay everywhere. You can tell when someone is just using the same essay everywhere because they'll use super generic language like, I want to go to this business school, Harvard Business School, whatever, because of its great curriculum, strong alumni network, and tons of great clubs. All right. Well, tell me a top 50 business school in the world that doesn't apply to, right? You're just spitting nonsense. Okay. But if you have a story that's built towards the strengths of a school and saying like, here's how it can really help me in important ways, that's a completely different thing. And it will position you as a much more serious candidate who's focused on that school and has thought about that school, and it's not just a copy paste job. All right. So yeah, absolutely try to find ways to make these things coherent and so they all stick together. In your experience, would you recommend time aspects? Okay, yeah, I already answered that. For the CBS career goals essay, how much of my past experience should I include? All right. Here's how to think about essays generally. This is kind of a big picture thing. And it's building on what I just said about having like this coherence in your essay. You want to make sure that your essays kind of track a path, which is past, present, future. What you did, what you're doing now, what you aspire to become. So in an essay about your career goals, all right, it can't feel like it's just coming out of nowhere, right? You want to start a certain type of company, right? You say, I'm really interested in, the virtual reality space and how that intersects with healthcare. For that to have any traction with the reader, you need to have had some experiences that somehow inform you. So there's not just like a pie in the sky idea because you saw 60 Minutes and then you wanted to build that company. It's much more meaningful if you say, look, I used to be a nurse or a doctor. I worked in a healthcare setting. I worked in a clinic. I saw this problem. I experienced something in my own life with healthcare, something that makes it clear that I understand this world and I also maybe have a technical background. And so it makes sense. Okay. So if, for example, take two essays. One essay is I worked in Pepsi and marketing and my background, I have a marketing degree from the University of Wisconsin, and I was heavily involved in advertising campaigns for the World Cup. Right. And I want to work in virtual reality in the healthcare sector, right? That doesn't really make sense, right? It's sort of this idea that pops out of there and say, how do those things connect? There's a lot more work that needs to be done. Whereas if you say, I worked in healthcare as a nurse and I saw how, people in old folks' home often felt lonely and I'm interested in using VR and artificial intelligence and AI in order to build communities that interact in order to solve this problem. That does make sense. And so in some ways, you have to figure out what in the past makes the thing that you're talking about as a career goal relevant and realistic, etc. Okay. How to start answers to generic questions like, which is your favorite book? So things like this, a lot of times. So like, let me give you an annoying answer again, and then explain it. Is it sort of depends? If it's just like if they give you 50 words to do it, then again, you're going to be a little bit more robotic and rote, where you say like, my favorite book is Sense and Sensibility because da 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 da. If you have more space, then the first sentence can often be kind of the why. So you say, I've always been fascinated by how class and economics intersects with personal relationships. And when I first read Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, these themes popped out. Right. So if you start with the why and then your second sentence is answering the question, I think that can be a good approach. Right. You frame kind of your answer and then you provide the answer. Is how you can answer something like that. I have a gap of 3 years since I finished my undergraduate. Can I make it to top schools? That depends on what you were doing. And like if you were, on the beach drinking Corona and surfing for 3 years, then probably not. But if you're doing substantive things, then obviously like the gap is really important. You know, so it would really, again, it really depends on what you've been doing and what you mean by gap. Most people who are applying to business schools aren't going directly from undergraduate. That's becoming a more and more rare thing. Um, and so, yeah, it's entirely how you filled that time. All right. For someone who would apply to several business schools, can I keep the crux of my personal statement the same and then tailor that story according to what a specific B school has to offer? Yeah, absolutely. You don't have to write, a whole new um, business school application from scratch every time. That would be needlessly labor intensive. The way that I would think about it, though, is that you don't think about it in terms of like, what can I take out? So I have my kind of template personal statement. What can I take out to add other things? Instead, think of it in terms of, okay, I have written my Stanford personal statement, and now I'm looking at Columbia. They want to know these things. And you can maybe, spend 10, 15 minutes and sketch out like a quick outline for what you think you want your Columbia essay to be. And then almost look at the Stanford essay as like something you can cannibalize. You can move stuff over. Okay. Because when you're positively, assertively adding things instead of just like taking things out, it's much more likely that you are being thoughtful about building something as opposed to just, tinkering and rejiggering something so that it fits this new purpose. And that's more likely to be a problem in terms of having like an essay that feels tailored to the school. But yeah, you don't have to start from scratch every single time. Um, how do you approach a story that would seem entirely unbelievable but is 100% true? Would you have it backed up by recommendations? Having it backed up by recommendations is good. Um, I guess uh, unbelievable but true is sort of difficult to understand. Like if you're unbelievable but unbelievable but true stories that um, you cured cancer, then people are like, well, that's not true, right? Um, But look, if you're applying to top schools, you will often find that the people who were there did extraordinary things. So it's not the bar for what's unbelievable is probably higher than you think. Um, but yeah, like if you feel that like there's some type of credibility gap, to have have a recommendation to back it up is good. The one thing I would say, and this is not to take a shot at Josh since I don't know him, but a lot of times people don't know that they're engaging in puffery. That is, they're exaggerating. So I remember so when I used to be a professor, and I had a freshman who was talking about, oh yeah, in high school I worked at a lab that was doing cancer research, and I led this study that did X, Y, and Z. And I happened to know the person who is a friend of mine from graduate school who led that lab, and I knew that what that student really was is a lab tech, because he's a high school kid, and this is what you're not leading any studies. Like he might have in his own mind thought that like, oh, every day as I'm washing the beakers, I'm actually contributing. No, wait, look, you're high school, you go there, you're kind of learning how a lab operates. That's good and that's normal. Cool. You're not doing anything substantive. You're not helping to cure cancer. You're keeping the trash bins empty and the beakers clean. So, as you go through this process, ask yourself, real questions. Excuse me. Is the framing of this experience actually what happened? Because it can sometimes be easy to fool yourself into thinking that you had this outsized impact. And so as long as you are honest with yourself and you tell the story in a really clear way, I don't necessarily think you have to have backup, but if you feel like I'm not sure they'll believe me, then sure, have an additional person um back up that story. And again, I think that a lot of times you'll be surprised that applicants to especially top schools do a lot of really cool things. Um and so they may very well believe without any type of additional substantive additions to your story. All right. Do we have any other questions? Um, all right. So, like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, service@gurufy.com, or you can visit us at our site. Um, it's been fun talking to you guys. I wish all of you guys the very best of luck in your MBA applications. I know this can be a really stressful season. My big picture pieces of advice are start early, and think about authenticity. Try to find ways to put yourself on the page and not the superhero version of you. Okay, don't try to be Tony Stark. Be you, and that'll end up coming across in a much more compelling way. I can tell you, having read thousands of these essays, that the things that you remember and the things that are actually more compelling are when people kind of bear themselves in an honest way. Okay, um, they come across as human beings and not as kind of these phony constructs designed to show how awesome they are. Okay. Um, I'll quickly answer this. Hi, Brian. Is it necessary that our past story must be related to the exact function that we're applying? I wouldn't necessarily say the exact function, but it does need to be relevant. All right. Again, past, present, and future should form a straight line. It should make sense. And you shouldn't just try to shoehorn something in if it's not really germane to what you're trying to do. You have some wiggle room, and you can think deeply about whether if this is a really core pivotal experience in your life. Then if you think about it, it should align with who you are and what you hope to be. Because if it doesn't, it's not that important, right? So yeah. All right. Again, I want to thank all of you guys. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm Brian at GuruFi. Yeah. And so I wish all of you guys a great weekend. And to all of the folks who stayed up super late, thank you for listening. And I look forward to seeing you guys at GuruFi.com. All right. Y'all have a great day.